Hi, friends. This is John, and this is the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast, where we talk about the agronomic science and cultural management practices that regenerate plant health, soil health, and public health. My guest for this episode is Dwayne Beck, a name that I'm sure many of you know, and for those of you who don't know, you certainly deserve to know his name. I'm very honored to have you join us today. Dwayne, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
You've conducted a lot of research. You were one of the pioneers of innovating no-till agriculture on the high plains in the North Dakota region. For our listeners who haven't heard of your history and background, can you tell us a little bit about your history and what brought you here?
Well, I'm just a good farm boy that went to college because that was better than the alternatives at the time. I was the youngest son, so you don't get to have the farm if you're the youngest son. But went to college, got a degree in chemistry because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Didn't realize you could do science in agriculture. Taught chemistry in a high school at Gettysburg, South Dakota for 3 years. And serendipitously met some people who got me back into graduate school at South Dakota State University, working on a PhD degree in soil fertility at that time. And most of that work was with irrigator people. And in that process of doing my work out there, again, around Gettysburg and Pierre and along the Missouri River, the irrigators were having fits with runoff. This is late 70s. They'd spent a lot of money because Earl Butz told them to farm fence row to fence row and produce everything they could. And so they spent a lot of money putting in irrigators to pump out of the main stem reservoirs on the Missouri River and then proceeded to run the water right back to the reservoir. So that's kind of when we started to look at ways of making water go into the soil better. And kind of in that transition from when I was doing my PhD work until I became a real person, we had some projects that started with Daryl DeBoer and people like that from ag engineering on looking at low pressure sprinklers and stopping water runoff under them, which was even worse than under high pressure. Lo and behold, through this research, we figured out that if we didn't till the soil, the water went in better. And that wasn't common knowledge at that period of time. But the second question then was, okay, if you don't do tillage, then how do you control all these other things if you don't have a whole suite of tools that basically we didn't have then that we do have now? And so we started looking at trying to do no-till, a little bit reduced till, and then full low disturbance no-till. And using some of this technique that I probably learned from my grandfather and my father in terms of how you manage pests and, diseases and weeds and insects through crop rotations and cultural practices and those kind of things. And when I finished my PhD, the university hired me to manage the research farm at Redfield, South Dakota, which was designed to be the place that the water from the Wahi Dam was supposed to go in a big canal to do gravity irrigation, flood irrigation type techniques on the Lake Dakota Plain, which is a glacial lake bottom, similar to the Red River Valley. And they put me managing that place because in this period of time, the local farmers, the irrigators that we were working with in terms of stopping runoff from their irrigators had started an organization with the goal of having a research farm more out toward the Missouri River to address the irrigation problems, because the station that was at Redfield, that project didn't look like it was ever going to be built, and it never was, which was a good thing. And that the water, if they were going to use it, would be done more out here. And the reason for that disconnect is when they designed the dams and whatever, that was in the 30s and 40s, nobody had invented the center pivot. So you couldn't irrigate the soils in this area because they were rolling land, and you can't do gravity irrigation on that. You need something perfectly flat. So that's kind of how it started. And then, once we started running the Redfield farm, they got the money together and the organization together to start this farmer-owned facility out along the river, and Redfield farm shut down and we came here, and I think it was a mistake to shut that one down, but it was a good thing to come here. And I've been here since. So it's and we've just done a lot of work in looking at dryland crop rotations predominantly. I mean, by the time we'd come here, we'd realize that the irrigation thing was going to work okay, but the lifts were so high that the cost associated with pumping water is limiting. And so there was going to be a limited amount of irrigation here, and the saving the water, making the water go into the soil was actually a real big deal for the dryland guys here. So we did a lot of work on dryland crop rotations and a lot of work on fertilizer placement and equipment development, like the little spiky closing wheels that everybody uses. Those the May West version of that, which is one of the first ones, was put together here, and the idea of putting a vertical wheel and a trench to push the seed in the bottom of the trench on a corn planter. We were kind of one of the first people to do that. So some of our ideas you saw come out through Exapta, some through other people. We never tried to really patent those. We were just trying to get them to the farmers. So we let everybody do whatever they needed to with them.
You've touched on a lot of pieces really quickly that I'd like to dig into a bit more deeply, but the first one that comes to mind is we still live in a world today where there is a lot of irrigation across the Midwest with center pivots, and we see the water levels in the Ogallala Aquifer continuing to decline. We still have lots of irrigation happening in desert regions in Arizona and New Mexico and California. And water infiltration continues to be a significant issue. I can't describe how many pivots I have walked into that behind the pivot, the water is running away from the pivot rather than infiltrating into the soil. I think there are still many people who aren't aware of the work that you have done historically. And I'd like to just open it up by asking the question, how much can water infiltration be improved by not tilling and by managing the soil differently? What really is possible, and what's the pathway to getting there?
Well, it's a bit soil dependent, but we have some very challenging soils here. And we can put on, in our normal practice at Dakota Lakes is we have them designed to match the worst case scenario for farmers in this area. So they will put on 1.2 gallons per minute per foot, which is equivalent to the very outside end of a standard center pivot, quarter section center pivot, putting on 900 gallons of water a minute. And that's where the water goes on the fastest. So we do that all the way across our machines, or three of our machines that are lateral moves, and that's the reason we're using lateral moves, so we can have that high intensity everywhere. And we run these very low pressure sprinklers on them, which means we put on 2 inches of water in 9 minutes when we come across to irrigate in the summertime. And
wow.
one of the yeah, it's pretty fast. And one of the things we do that is the most effective thing that I do is if we have people visiting in the summer, we will just always, the guys know that when we have a group, they know we're going to have show and tell. So even if we don't need to be irrigating, we'll turn something on just to show off, and we'll have a machine running that fast. We'll throw a pan down so they can see how fast the pan fills up. And then we walk them behind the machine, and they will not get their feet muddy, which will totally drive them crazy. And it's so dramatic that then the argument is pretty much over in terms of, okay, I can't do that in my place or whatever. Now, the soils we have here, probably 2/3 of the ones we irrigate are true vertisols. There's these really heavy clay soils that developed in an ocean bottom. And so they're 75 to 80% Montmorillon clays. the other day I was going through some stuff and I looked at the soils analysis of one of our experts at SDSU when we looked at this site. And he had made the statement that the northern part of the farm we would never be able to irrigate because we couldn't get good enough infiltration. Well, we can get that on these soils. And then we have these less-dry soils, which would be similar to northwest Iowa or something, where they tend to seal up really easily. Ukraine has the same kind of soils because all the particles are the same size. And so if you hit them with a raindrop, they'll seal up. And we get that kind of infiltration on them as well. So it doesn't really make any difference to us. But the important part is we get that same infiltration on the dryland. And so when we do get a big rain, the water goes in the soil instead of running off. And with irrigation, if you got enough money and if you have enough time, you can pump more water, maybe. But on dryland, you don't get a second shot at it. So, but you're right. They have a huge problem. And I've worked with people in different areas, and this whole idea of somebody doing intensive tillage in the area where they're pumping the aquifer dry, whether it be in California or in Oklahoma or Texas or whatever, it's just insane. And I'm not sure that we can expect to be allowed to continue to do things like that in the future without somebody calling us on it. It's not a responsible thing to do because that water resource belongs to lots of people, even though I may have a water right, which whatever, but it's one of the things we do at the farm here, which is somewhat related, is the farm is owned by a group of farmers. So I work with an 11-member board of directors that represent 500 and some farmers that have these long-term goals. And so we try to look further down the road as far as, 100 years, 50 years, 100 years, 600 years. If I continue to do what I'm doing now, what's it going to look like here? In South Dakota, our statehood was 1889. So there wasn't much here before 1889. Lewis and Clark came through in 1804. And we've degraded the ecosystem pretty dramatically in the U.S. in 200 years. It's not just the infiltration, is that's the right thing to do in the long run, is to degrade the soils like this.
There are several issues that you raised that are worth addressing. There's the soil degradation, and think about in your comments about continuing to pump water out of the aquifers. Perhaps in the short term, it's a question of, do we have permission to continue doing this, kind of social, societal permission to continue doing this? But if you go a bit longer term, a single generation or less, it will no longer be a question of permission. It will only be a question of, if we keep doing this, there will be no water left in the aquifer.
Yeah, no, it'll be gone. That's right. And then what's your plan B? We don't have a plan B. And it's not just the U.S. Argentina's got some real challenges with what they're doing right now. And I have a slide that I use in my presentations that I say that ecosystem and soil degradation is not a problem. It's the symptom. And the problem is greed and hubris and, inattention. And there's a whole list of things that, indifference and whatever. I mean, tillage is one of the tools that we do, but it's not the problem either. The problem is all these societal things, the farm policies and whatever. But the short-term thinking and thinking that we're smarter than the ecosystem, so we can, if we damage something, then we can turn around and add something and it's better. And I don't think that that's true. If we're not mimicking the natural ecosystem processes, we have issues.
I think the piece that I'm really intrigued with what you described is when you have 2 inches of infiltration capability in 9 minutes. Actually, I do have to play angel's advocate for just a moment here. If they don't get their boots muddy, is that because the soil is covered with crop residue and never had soil contact in the first place?
Well, yeah, it's covered, but the big difference is Macropore Flow. So it's more similar to your lawn. I mean, you could put 2 inches of water on your lawn and walk out there and you never get mud either. it's because the soil particles are in a structure, so there's structure there that supports you. And then the macropores, these big holes formed by worms and termites and roots and whatever, when the water falls on the soil and it is cushioned a bit by the residue that's there, it will go down that hole. And when it goes down that hole, it will find the dry spot in the soil and soak in from the side. So what you've done is magnified your infiltration area by several orders of magnitude. That's a real secret to a lot of things that we do is the Macropore Flow. And it took me a while to figure that out because it doesn't happen overnight. But when you do tillage, then everything has to go through the matrix in between each of the little particles. And every time it hits a discontinuity, it stops. Like if you have clay over silt someplace in there, or if you have a plow pan or whatever, that's more of a discontinuity. And when that water gets there, it has to stop and saturate some areas, and then it can start to flow into the next layer.
Have you ever measured your maximum infiltration rate on the heavy clay soils, the vertisols that you were describing?
Yeah. Well, we have an experiment with phosphorus because we're doing a lot of things with phosphorus because we don't want our phosphorus to go to the lakes. And that's maybe a whole nother conversation. But we've been trying to do an infiltration thing on fields where we've got these phosphorus treatments. This spring, my guy put on over 20 inches of water in an hour before he got some water to run. So
wow.
You're going to go like, okay.
Well, what I'm really intrigued by is for the last couple of decades, the conversation around water has really revolved around water infiltration. And we've forgotten, or we haven't often discussed, that there's more to that story. There's also percolation. You can infiltrate 2 inches in 9 minutes, but what happens if you filled up the upper layers and you can't percolate downward? And then the third aspect is, does that soil have the capacity to lift that water back up and deliver it to the crop? Water delivery and water infiltration are sometimes two very different things. I think we haven't appreciated that enough. So when you have the capacity to absorb 20 inches of water in an hour, I would imagine that also means you have a really incredible capacity to deliver water to the crop throughout a growing season.
Well, you do, and on the soils that he was on, those are some of our better soils in terms of water holding capacity. On the heavy clays, we have shale at 4 feet. So that water doesn't go below that. It will perch a water table on top of it, which eventually will go sideways. So that it's not a good thing to do that necessarily. What we wanted to look at with this thing is what happens to phosphorus when it doesn't run off. And now it's going down those macropores maybe, and how much is sticking to the soil, and then how much gets down to the bottom. And if I had drain tile, how much would go out the drain tile, which it does do now. People have figured that out. So how much of it can we stick? And the real secret to the whole thing is the fact that the macropore allows you to fill the soil in the areas where it's dry. Because once it runs off or de-percolates, you don't have it. You can't get it back anymore necessarily. So then, can you fill the soil if your surface is wet? Can you put water down below and fill that zone below, which used to be when guys did summer fallow and whatever, it was very hard to do that. And the way we figured that out was time we spent at Redfield, where we have the lacustrine soils, lake bottom soils, because lake bottom soils, if you take a probe out there and look at them, it looks like Oreos when you get down a ways. That lacustrine means a glacial lake. It was a lake during glacial times, 20,000 years ago. And in the spring, when you'd get melting, you'd have this meltwater come in, which was pretty heavily laden with silt. And the sand part of that would settle out first and form a layer, and then the silt part would form a layer, and then the clay part would form a layer. And the next spring, you'd have the same thing happen. And that happened for 1,000 or 2,000 years during that period of time. So you have these layers in that soil. And if you try to get the water to flow through that soil on its own, you have to saturate the clay before the water moves into the silt, and you have to saturate the silt before the water moves into the sand. So you're saturating each of these little layers independently as you're going down, and it just got awful how slow the water goes in the soil. But as soon as you have macropores, then you get this thing we talk about. Even though we don't have the lacustrine soils here, we had the same thing happen in the James River Valley when we started. And it just floored us that would happen. And the ag engineers and everybody just all scratched their heads, and me included, But that's the way nature would have worked. If you go into a native prairie or whatever, you just have tons of those macropores. I mean, you can go to a native prairie and put 2 inches of water on 9 minutes. Doesn't run off either unless it's been overgrazed and capped and whatever. It's how that was managed.
When you were describing this process, you mentioned a phrase that caught my ear, which is summer fallowing. Now, I've observed a few instances in southwest Kansas and in west or eastern Washington and parts of Montana that I've become persuaded that the idea of summer fallowing is a really crazy idea, but I'm not from those areas. And so when I tell people that, they think I'm a few bricks short of a load. So I'd love to hear your perspective on summer fallowing. What have you observed?
You're one of those eastern guys.
Exactly.
This area where Dakota Lakes was predominantly wheat and summer fallow in the 1970s when we kind of entered the picture here. And, with pretty intensive tillage, and they were doing winter wheat. And they were saying it was to conserve moisture. And what it really does is allows them to mine the nitrogen a bit faster. Because if you were in the old days where you really didn't have the fertilizers and whatever, and you were going to grow crop out here, you had all this organic matter that built up by the native prairies over the years. And if you tilled it for 6-7 times between growing crops, you had more nitrogen available than if you just try to continuously crop, because you've decayed more of the organic matter. And you didn't necessarily have the moisture at that time if you're also using tillage to grow legumes like you could further east, where you could put the meadows or whatever in for a while. And if you're doing tillage, you really couldn't do that well. And so it was really a way of doing a better job of mining the nutrients from the soil. And I have one of these slides I use that sometimes gets rocks thrown at me, but I just say that tillage is to agriculture what fracking is to petroleum, in that it speeds the ability to extract nutrients from the substrate and leaves the substrate degraded. And if you're mining, that's really what you want to do anyway. The more you can get out of there, the better. But if you flip your thinking to long-term thinking instead of short-term thinking, then it doesn't make any sense. But this was short-term stuff. We came here, you'd break it, you'd farm it, and then eventually you'd move on. I mean, that way, and it's not dissimilar from slash and burn agriculture in the tropics. The idea of the burning is to try to speed that release of the nutrients. But again, we haven't done this for very long, and we've already started to degrade things pretty quickly. And the eastern areas, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, somewhat famous farmers, were discussing soil degradation in the late 1700s. They sent letters back and forth to each other and said, if we don't stop this degradation of the soils in the eastern seaboard, we'll have to move west to find better soils again.
And we can repeat the process there.
Yeah, and that's right. And then in 1804, they bought the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, hello. But you go to France. I mean, the reason that the Europeans came here is because they degraded the ecosystem so bad in Europe, they had to go somewhere else. and they came here, and they came to Australia, and they came to South America. And those places are pretty well mined out. And it's really a long-term, it's really the long-term thinking thing that is messed up. And, I'll give a plug to a book if it's okay with you.
Of course.
Darren Qualman has written a book called Civilization Critical, where he talks about this idea of linear systems where we're extracting stuff versus cyclic systems, which is what nature is more cyclic. And he does a really good job of describing this stuff. And, we've been thinking that way, but we're not as eloquent as he is in terms of discussing it. But that's really what needs to happen. I mean, the idea of mining the nutrients from the North American continent to send them initially to Europe, beaver and the buffalo robes and whatever, but now the soybeans and the corn and the wheat, and now to China. And we're doing that probably at the cost of degrading our ecosystem and probably below the cost of production. So I don't know who gets value from that. I mean, I think that's one of the things, if you start looking long term, you kind of start scratching your head, saying, why are we doing this?
I think there's lots of things in our society that would be worth scratching our heads about. But I want to come back to summer fallowing. You described summer fallowing as essentially a process allowing us to better extract nutrients, particularly nitrogen and others, from the soil profile, not so much water conservation, which makes sense to me because particularly when you're using tillage for summer fallow, of course, many people today are using glyphosate, but if you're using tillage, of course, you're losing a lot of moisture through evaporation as well. So the question that I want to ask in a nutshell is summer fallowing and biennial production necessary for moisture management, or can you grow a crop every year?
Yeah, well, what we did here, like I said, this area here, and you can go quite a ways west of here, used to be all wheat and summer fallow. And now the guys here grow a crop every year. And we're probably on the eastern edge of the summer fallow hotspot. So let's say that we have a little bit more moisture than a guy in Montana or something like that, or Alberta. But we now grow a crop every year, and at least half of those crops, most of the farmers here that are good no-tillers and whatever, half of their crops are high water use crops like corn and sunflower and sorghum and those kind. So they've been very successful. Snow catch is a big part of that. Having good surface residue is part of that. As you go further west, I still think it's possible. And I have, written things on diversity and intensity. And as you get further west, your ability to grow, let's say the corn thing, or depending on your soils, becomes more challenging. But you can still grow crops every year, but maybe you're going to grow a forage crop instead of a grain crop at times. And a lot of that depends on your soil. So the carte blanche summer fallow thing, in most cases, I'd say I can never see situations where full season fallows make any sense. Now, when you add glyphosate to a full season summer fallow thing, you really make your salinity problems and stuff much worse, because now instead of the water running off, it goes into the soil and it de-percolates, and the soil doesn't hold that much water. So you've made the salinity problem come forward. And we see this even in the Corn Belt or in more humid areas, where when they started doing no-till, the salinity gets worse because the water now is going into the soil instead of running off. And that means their rotational intensity, what they're doing in terms of using water, isn't matching the water that goes in. And it comes down to those natural cycles. So if you're not mimicking the water cycle, you're making it go in the ground, but you're not using it, which Mother Nature, if it goes in the soil, she'll use it. If you're not doing that, then you start creating some problems. But yeah, summer fallow kind of went away, and we use the Dakota Lakes Research Farm and the Redfield Farm, the main area they influenced initially was a central sector in the state of South Dakota. So that's covered by South Dakota is a pretty big state, but it's not like a Texas or whatever. It's like in Nebraska. So it's a middle third, let's say, of the state. And so we did an exercise a few years ago where we looked at the productivity of this area in 1986 initially. And that was before we really had gotten started, and it was before glyphosate and all that stuff. Before glyphosate was cheap, but it had a rainfall characteristic similar to 2014. And so we took 1986 and compared that area to 1986 and 2014. And then we looked at, how much grain they produced those 2 years and what that grain was worth the night before we were going to present this to the Board of Regents. And the difference in productivity or the profitability or whatever you want to call it, total production, was $1.6 billion with a B. It was huge. And all you have to do is come here and drive up and down Highway 83, and you see grain bins and you see new houses, but you also see small communities that now are starting to revitalize. So they got to the point where they thought the schools were going to have to close, and some of the schools did close. And now we have schools again, and we have elementary, 2 sections of elementary kids in the schools where they almost closed the school. And we have processing plants, pea processing and ethanol plants and those kind of things. So that's a big win.
That's a significant change in changing local communities like that.
When you export everything, the nutrients and whatever, just export the grain. You don't need the people. And we've got mechanization in terms of how we farm now that you don't need the people to do the kind of work that we used to do by hand, picking corn by hand, for instance. I mean, I pick as much corn in 2 minutes as my dad picked in a whole day. I mean, it's like zoom. And so we don't need the labor to do the farming. So what are we going to do with them? And if we export all that stuff and don't take it higher on the food chain, then the people leave too. In Argentina, they're leaving the country. Here they leave the countryside and go to the cities, but in Argentina, a lot of them leave the country and go to the U.S. or go to Europe or something.
Yeah, and there's economic issues involved there as well. You mentioned a concept that I'm guessing many people are not familiar with, the idea of de-percolation and using the water that you add. Can you describe what is happening and what is going on?
Well, and it happens everywhere, which is interesting, but you got to look at the native vegetation and what does it do with water. In your country, you had these tall grasses, or you had trees or something like that had these massive root systems that go very deep. And so they would grow and extract the water from a great depth during the hot part of the year, and they put moisture into the atmosphere and all this stuff. When you start to do tillage and grow only annual crops, the water doesn't get extracted from those depths. And so now you're farming in the Corn Belt, you're farming the top 3 feet pretty much because your roots really don't go much deeper than that. Now, if I take a good soil that holds 2 inches of water per foot, that's only 6 inches of total water. So what happens is, as soon as you get any appreciable rainfall, you're too wet. And so then we have to have the drain tile, which means that water leaves, but takes a bunch of things with it that shouldn't go. And then when you get a dry period, you only have 6 inches of reservoir. So you're working with a little tiny bucket. Whereas if you had mixed in the system like they used to do until not very long ago, where they had perennial species in the system, you would suck the soil dry at times all the way down to maybe 6-8 feet. So now when you got a wet year, that bottom portion of the soil was empty that you don't use for annual crops. So when you transition from that perennial back to an annual, that bottom part was dry. But that's no big deal because you don't use it anyway for that annual crop, but it's a place for that water to go when you get a big rainfall event. So I don't think
it gives you a lot more resilience.
And it gives you a lot more resilience, and you build organic matter during that period of time. So your bucket now holds 2.5 inches per foot. I mean, there's a whole bunch of pieces to that puzzle, but we're just not using it very well. When you go to Australia, for instance, where the rainfall comes in the wintertime, they don't get a lot of rainfall necessarily, but it all comes in the wintertime. And their soils hold very little water, probably 1 inch per foot, something like that. So they constantly, as soon as they take their big trees, if they have their big trees in there, the trees will bring the nutrients up, and then the nutrients fall off of the tree, and they end up back on the surface. And so they cycle their nutrients and keep the saline seeps away. As soon as they clear that land and start farming it, they form saline seeps everywhere, and the water table rises, and there's a whole bunch of bad things that happen to them there. But they haven't mimicked what the natural ecosystem was doing. And I don't know that I have all the answers to all those things, but it's, where the problem lies. Putting in a perennial sequence will probably be necessary for the long term if we're going to do it. We'll have to figure out how to do it. Now, putting in alfalfa and selling the hay is not the right answer because you're taking all the nutrients and shipping them away. So that's not the right answer, right? But it does do the thing you need to do by extracting the water from down there, but it's selling all the nutrients.
Yeah, we need perennials that we can cycle the nutrients locally within the system, as you described.
Yeah, and that means cows. It means livestock.
Right.
Or it means something different than what we're doing. I mean, there's trees that grow that are legumes, and the leaves that drop off are very high in nitrogen. And there's places where they use that in a corn production system to provide the nitrogen for the corn. They grow the corn between the trees. And during the warm weather, the trees get rid of their leaves during warm weather, not cool weather. So it's a different ecosystem than we have in the U.S., I think, but it's an interesting concept. Can use these perennials somehow in concert with the crops we need to grow for. If we're growing corn to take it to a feedlot to feed cows, maybe we just move the cows out to the field. And
many innumerable ecosystem benefits to moving the cows to the field. And so when we think about nutrient cycling, you spoke earlier about your historical research with fertilizer placement and some of the recent research you're doing with evaluating how phosphorus moves in the ecosystem. I'm actually reminded of a quote, I believe it's originally attributed to William Albrecht, where he said, "The art of fertilizer placement is about figuring out how to place the fertilizer so the roots can dodge it." And I always got a bang out of that because it's really a description of fertilizers of that day and even still today having a high salt index and temporarily, when present in high concentration, challenge to developing root systems and to biology. So I'd love to learn more about what you have learned with your research and what do you see as the future of fertility management and nutrition management?
Well, when it comes to phosphorus, my PhD is in fertility, so I always say it's easy. You just have to have available nutrient in an area where there's active roots and adequate water, and then the plant figures it all out after that, right? So now the devil in the detail is what do I mean by active roots and what's available, quote unquote, nutrient and those kind of things. And when it comes specifically to phosphorus, there's a lot of phosphorus in our soils, but it's not, quote unquote, available to a normal plant, especially in tilled systems, because you don't have the mycorrhizal fungi populations and things there. But if you start no-tilling and you're not doing disturbance and you're not killing the mycorrhizal fungi webs that you have out there, then you have these massive root systems because your plant makes an association with the mycorrhizae, and that mycorrhizae helps it get phosphorus and a bunch of the cations like zinc and whatever out of the soil. So what we're doing is really changing the equation, and not that the guys that did soil fertility research and calibrated soil tests were wrong, but they calibrated things like the Olson, the Bray, and Malick phosphorus tests for tilled systems to serve the needs of plants that had no mycorrhizal fungi. And the way I explain the mycorrhizal fungi thing to people, they said, do you ever drive through the mountains and see a tree growing out of a rock and wondering how the heck it could do that? Well, it can only do that if it has these mycorrhizal associations with going on in there that are help bring all these nutrients in exchange for the carbon that it's getting from the tree. Of course, our irrigated ground is located right adjacent to the Missouri River, so we're very cognizant of not moving phosphorus to the river. That's why we're doing this. And we can't continue to turn the lakes in the east green, or it would just not be a thing we should do. And we can't defend that. We intentionally drew the soil phosphorus Olson, we use an Olson test here, down to less than 5 parts per million on all of our irrigated ground. And then we took one field and we put strips in there where we built some of it back up, where we put on, like, over the last 4 or 5 years, 300 to 600 pounds of MAP to build it back up some. We're not getting a yield response. And now we are placing some replacement phosphorus adjacent to the seed at planting time. So we're putting like 45 pounds of MAP out there. But we don't see a yield response. And I said to a good friend of mine the other day, I said, it's just amazing to me that we can have these 5 part per million and less soils with 50 pounds of MAP. And I was combining a field of irrigated corn that was running 260, which in the east isn't that great of corn, but it's pretty good corn for us. How does it do that? Well, I have about 6,000 or 7,000 pounds of total phosphorus to 4 feet. So it's there. It just isn't soluble. And if it isn't soluble, it's not going to go to the river. And that's what we're finding in our tests, because we're doing these things with the runoff and whatever, and it's not moving. First of all, because we're not moving the water. And second of all, if we can make the water move, there isn't a lot of phosphorus that goes with it.
This is something we've experienced as well in our work. We end up, based on soil and sap analysis data, we end up significantly reducing nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus applications. Usually to the point where nitrogen, potassium, it's not uncommon for us to approach zero applications after a couple of years, because it is all being delivered from soil biology. And the same happens for phosphorus as well, depending on the native geology. Of course, there's some soils for which that isn't going to happen very easily.
Yeah, there's low testing P. There's some soils that are just inherently low in phosphorus. But we think the phosphorus thing, we can get really low and stay there. And especially now that we have livestock in the system, because we're cycling. And, one of the things I talk to farmers about is if I ship my soybeans to China or wherever, every unit train of soybeans that leaves has about 450,000 pounds of phosphate in it. That's not coming back. And whether it goes, maybe it only needs to go to North Carolina, it still isn't coming back. Whereas if I grow soybeans, which we do, and sunflowers and some other things, and we press the oil from them on farm, which we do, and we feed the meal to our livestock, but we sell the oil. The only thing I've sold in the oil that goes away is sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. Whereas if I sell the bean or I sell the meal, then the nutrients go away too. So it's a long-term goal thing. We do place nitrogen in proximity in our no-till stuff. We place nitrogen proximity to the corn row when we plant. And that's the thing that is the most automatic for us to get a yield response, because we're a little bit far north. So a lot of our cycling of nitrogen doesn't happen early. It happens later in the years. We have to put nitrogen in that area close to the row to get the early growth that we think we need for the high yields. Corn decides how big an ear it can grow when it's like B4 or B5. We haven't seen as much response to placing of the phosphorus. We just like to put it there because it's convenient. We don't see as much response to the phosphorus placement. We do in wheat, but we don't in soybeans and corn. But we consistently see a response in corn to soybean and sulfur and nitrogen placed in proximity to the row. And I think that's because nitrogen moves to the root with water. The root doesn't necessarily move to the nitrogen, and there's not very much water use early in the year. And so if you just broadcast it out there, whatever, it has trouble getting enough. When you did lots of tillage, you had a lot more nitrogen sitting there, but why would you want it there at that period of time? And so if we can get the plant going early, then the nitrogen becomes available later. I don't think we have our soils here. They were pretty badly degraded, quite to the point where they're self-sufficient on hand. Because we are selling products yet too. So we do sell wheat and some of those things. So
as you have changed your cultural management practices or tillage and agronomy management, what have you observed with pest management? You described that you adapted some historical practices for managing pests with crop rotations and cultural management. What have you observed and what are you doing?
Well, weeds, disease, and insects are Mother Nature's way of adding diversity to a system that lacks diversity. So let's start with that. We haven't used an insecticide here. This was the 18th year where we haven't sprayed an insecticide out there for anything. We have a massive population of predators. But if I started using, I'm very concerned because there's times when I do get seed that I buy that has some neonic on it or something, which we don't like, but you can't always avoid it. So we get concerned about that because we want to protect our predators. So if we put a blank application on something, we just whack the predators big time. Weeds, it was one of the things that worried me immensely when we started. I'm not afraid of weeds right now, but crop rotation is a big part of that. And low disturbance is a big part of that because there's a population of weed seeds at depth here that came before me that if I did tillage, those would all have a shot again. So if I leave the sleeping dogs lie and I use very low disturbance techniques, the vertical tillage and all those things that people are doing, it's a good way of planting weeds. We have data on all this stuff that is very dramatic about what we can do with controlling weeds with crop rotation in combination with low disturbance. Because if you have a weed like, I'll take the evil weed of the year, Palmer amaranth. Well, if you have a couple of years in there of cereal grain in a row, it just wipes them out. They don't have a chance. Because by the time the palmer starts to grow, the wheat's got full canopy. And some of the stuff that we're doing, in the higher rainfall areas that people are doing with cover crops and things, that's another part of that thing. So I always, in the beginning, and I still say it if I think about it, but the thing that we use for weed control, or maybe pest control in general, but weed control is competition, sanitation, and rotation. So I try to keep weeds from getting into the field. I try to keep weeds that are there from going to seed. So we control the weed seed bank. Part of that's done with rotation. So you got sanitation, you got the rotation. So if you've got palmer, you rotate into something like winter wheat that's highly competitive. It's all interrelated, of course. In competition, what we want to do is to keep the weed at bay until my plant can get big enough to outcompete it. And that's all part of that thought process, and they all work together, and herbicides are part of that to a certain extent, in that we use them to make sure a weed doesn't go to seed, or we use them to inhibit a weed long enough for my crop to get big enough to compete. And I'd like to see us have some other non-chemical weed control methods. I've thought of doing things like with liquid nitrogen to freeze things. I don't know, whatever. But tillage just isn't an option, because once you do tillage, you can't control an ecosystem if you do tillage. I mean, tillage is just the non-starter. There's no such thing as a little bit of tillage. And we've piddled with all that. I've done the vertical tillage. I've done the whatever over the years. Strip till, we've done some of that. And it just has too many negatives because you just throw everything out of whack. We're not all that concerned. Now, if we have this movement going on that's trying to say that we can do no-till and organic, I haven't really seen that defined well. and they start calling, we've had the term regenerative for years. It's been on our sign for at least 20 years. But that's not well defined now either, because everybody seems to grab a hold of it. But then what does it mean? And so I have some concerns about some of those trends we're starting right now. I mean, our definition of regenerative is that we're matching natural water nutrient cycles, capturing sunlight comparable to natural systems. I don't think you can do that if you're doing tillage. I don't know. The other day, I think I had somebody from NPR that was talking to me or emailed me or whatever, and I said the problem with organic systems is not what they're intending to do. And what they're intending to do and what we're intending to do is exactly the same. We want to produce healthy food in a manner that doesn't screw up the ecosystem. And so now we're down to how do you do that? And organic systems are based on tradition. They're not really based on science. They're based on tradition. And, traditional farming systems tended to fail after about 500 years. Agrarian societies, read David Montgomery's stuff. I mean, traditional farming systems tend to fail fairly quickly. Now, if you had enough land area, you could come in and do a destructive system for 10 or 15 or 20 years and then move on and let the rainforest come back. But I don't think we have the land to do that anymore. So we tended to think we need to do something better than that. We want to base it on science, but we still want to do those concepts of where we have healthy food and then we protect the ecosystem. And that entails mimicking those natural cycles. If you don't mimic the natural cycle, you screw it up to the point where you have to put in artificial methods of trying to control water or whatever, then you have some issues.
This raises an important question. Obviously, you have had incredible experience. You've been a very outspoken advocate of the need to not till your soils. You've been able to very clearly communicate the challenges that occur when you do till. We haven't really gotten into this so much in this conversation, perhaps a little bit, but it's certainly something you have described and many other people have described very well. Now that raises a challenge for growers who are growing potatoes and carrots and sugar beets.
Yeah, I always say, well, in sugar beets, just everybody should quit eating sugar anyway, but
I agree with you on that one.
But, I think those are engineering problems. I think you could pull a sugar beet out of the ground without doing tillage. It's just an engineering issue. It's just easier to do it if you plow them out of the ground. But I think the Germans are working on one where they grab it, vibrate it out of the ground. And I don't know that would be a problem. Potatoes, my mother, who was of Dutch ancestry, grew her potatoes under a bed of straw. So we never dug potatoes. We just ruffled them out of the straw pile. And there are some people looking at doing that. So I always say these are engineering problems, not necessarily agronomic problems. So I just kind of skirt off to the edge of those. But
it's my job as an interviewer, though, Dwayne, to hold your feet to the fire a little bit. So you haven't given me an answer for carrots yet on a scale of 50 acres at a time.
Well, whatever. I no-till my carrots in my garden, and we no-till our garden, and we can pull them fine, but you have to vibrate them a little bit. But I don't think carrots are quite as hard. I don't think you have to disrupt the whole area to get them to come out. Now they are loosening the ground. The last one I saw like 2 days ago, they were running a little wavy cola alongside the row and pulling them out by the tops.
I also think that I really personally believe that that is also not just an engineering problem in the case of speaking to carrots specifically, but also perhaps a genetics problem, that we can actually grow a crop with a strong enough top to easily pull it out.
No, and I think you're right. I think we need to do that, and that means realizing that it's like with tillage. If you just said tillage is not an option, and then you start looking at alternatives. And in our case, that was a bit of the deal, because if we did tillage, we had runoff. But also the research farm at Redfield had no equipment. I mean, I had a 706 and a 3-bottom plow when I went there. So if you're going to try to be a real farmer and pretend you're a real farmer, we weren't going to make it if we tried to use conventional methods, because we didn't have the equipment, we didn't have the money to buy it. So we bypassed it and went right basically to no-till, a little ridge till in the beginning and then no-till, and didn't need the equipment. It was a necessity thing. An analogy to that is the first time I went to Australia, we barely had cell phones in this part of the world. If it did, it was one of the big bag phones that you had to stick up on top of the car on top of the hill to talk to anybody. And they had them all over Australia, but they didn't have their landlines. It just wasn't efficient for them to try to build landlines all the way into the outback, but pretty easy to put in some cell towers. And that's a similar analogy. You know, if we just didn't have the incentives to do tillage, we wouldn't do them. We would not do it. You know, the government makes our tractors cheap because we can write off the money we spend on them.
And nitrogen cheap, and fuel prices cheap, and corn
and they
prices
give us
cheap.
subsidies. And they give us subsidies. I get my check the other day. Pretty excited.
Dwayne, I think you and your organization are perhaps unique in agriculture in taking the long-term view and asking the question of what will our ecosystems look like if we continue to manage them as we are now in 600 years from now. With that perspective, what do you see happening in the future, and what do you see as the changes that need to be brought about in agriculture in the future?
Well, I don't know what we're going to see in the future. I don't know how we get government, society, and business to take a long-term view. I think they used to have a longer-term view than they do now, and right now it's about a 15-minute thing. Government, you know, what's the stock market doing today, you know, type thing. But government specifically is only looking at the next election cycle. And I don't know where you get the maturity of person to show up there and discuss this long-term stuff. But it has to be, I think it has to be farmers for one, because if they're want to stay in farming, they want their kids to be in farming, and they want their grandkids to be in farming, then we need to start thinking like that. And, you know, you mentioned our organization briefly, but it's, you know, it's a group of farmers, and the people on the board are farmers, and it's not an advisory board, they're owners. They have to pay money to join. It's not a lot of money, but they're owners, and they're treated like owners. But we have on our board right now a person that's the great-grandson of one of the guys I worked with in the beginning. Not just a grandson, a great-grandson. And, you know, and I worked with him and his dad, or his son, you know, who's this kid's grandpa. So that's what we're talking about. We strive very hard to get these young guys, young people involved in the system, because they're going to be the future. And what do I see in the future? I think we've got to take the long-term approach, and I think we need to sell our products to the consumer. 100 years ago, 120 years ago, 100 years ago, sometimes less than that, everybody bought their food from somebody they knew. Either they knew the farmer, or they knew the butcher, or they knew whatever, but they knew that person, and they trusted that person. And we need to reestablish that trust. And I think the the next generation will be able to do that using the power of the internet and social media and whatever. So instead of coming to see me, you'll have a virtual tour of what we do. And by the way, we did have a virtual tour this year that posted. So it's quite interesting they did a good job. We have several hours of video up showing what we've done. So we can do that, and we can say, what's important to you? And this is how we're doing this. We will do this for you. Whereas the big companies are trying to hop into this market, but they keep saying they want to do this. And boy, this is exactly what we want to do. But when push comes to shove, as soon as the guy that said he was really interested moves to a different position, the next guy isn't as interested. Or when they find out it's really difficult. Because this isn't easy stuff. It's difficult. And I see that is our future, I think. And that makes us more cyclic. And I think maybe the pandemic thing is focused a bit more on this. When people were running out of flour, I just kind of grinned, I got flour. I got my own wheat, I got my grinder, and I make my own flour, and I make bread out of it. Now, we haven't been making bread for anybody else, but we can do that. And we can make beef for somebody else, but we have to go back to figure out how we harvest that beef, which is what we're looking at now, is how do you raise it and how do you harvest it. Our beef never goes to a feedlot. It's out in the field. Steal from Gabe Brown, but he said, he had a really great life and one really bad day. I mean, it's type of thing, but that's really the way it should be. So I see that as being the future, because that's where we're going to harvest the value. Right now, I've got a talk I give now, which I talk about we're doing a really good job of doing the wrong thing instead of focusing on doing the right thing. So, maybe for quite a bit in their early career, we were teaching people how to do this, raise crops for export stuff way better. And they're making $1.6 billion more in this area, and they're all happy, and they got their kids at home, and things are good, but we're still exporting all our nutrients. We're doing a really good job of doing the wrong thing. And the secret is to turn that now to a point where now we're doing a really good job of doing the right thing, which is building these cyclic systems.
What has to happen to bring that about? What has to happen to doing the right thing on scale?
Well, Ralph Holdsworth from Gettysburg, who was one of our first real leaders in this and president for quite a while, he would always talk about it as a brain transplant, a different way of thinking about things. So what has to happen? I think we need to try to get a more level playing field. Right now, with the crop insurance and not to say we don't need some insurance, but the crop insurance subsidies and the subsidy type things that are going on, and then agriculture gets involved in the politics, international politics thing, and it's a weapon or it's not food, it's something else. And I think we need to go back and change our thinking, this brain transplant, and think about it. What we're doing is producing food. How do I produce that food, and what am I producing it for?
When you think about the brain transplant, we can begin, of course, by sharing ideas and information, which is why I started hosting this podcast. So that leads me to an important question. What is the one thing that you wish all farmers knew?
Oh, see, people are really good at interviews. They go, "That's a really good question," while they're thinking of an answer. So that's what I'm doing right now. But I wish they knew that Mother Nature bats last. So if you're not doing something that fits into her system, she wins. Buzz Clute, who you probably know, was interviewing me one day, and I said I get a kick out of, because we at that time several years ago we had a lot of people at the university that their sole focus was on genetic manipulation stuff. And I said, we have all these gene jockeys down there, and they keep coming up with these new things and go, isn't this neat what I have here? And I said, Mother Nature's looking over their shoulder and going, oh, you damn amateur. You know, I've done this stuff for millions of years, you know. Watch this. Zip. You know, and that's just the way it is. I mean, so when you're trying to not do, if you're trying to change the natural system, you're just never going to be successful long term. You know, the guys that came, I used Lewis and Clark. Lewis actually walked across the south part of our property in 1804 taking notes. So I know what was here. And between 1804 and statehood in 1899, there wasn't a lot of things happening other than we killed the native animals, the buffalo or the bison and the beaver and whatever. The wolves, we just had a heyday in here and sent those off to Europe to make coats and hats and whatever. And then statehood happened and people started moving in and doing tillage and overgrazing and all these things. And in less than 50 years between statehood, basically when humans showed up and when we had the Dust Bowl, was less than 50 years.
The way this conversation has been framed so far is how things degraded when humans arrived. But that is approaching the conversation under the assumption that
European humans arrived. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
European ancestry people arrived.
I believe this ecosystem was a highly managed ecosystem, managed differently than we are managing it and producing different crops, of course, but still highly managed by a very evolved society.
Lewis and Clark stopped in Bismarck, North Dakota, and bought corn from the natives in Bismarck.
Wow.
Which I gave a meeting in the very early 90s in Bismarck one day, and a big meeting, a lot of people, 1,500 people there or something. And I suggested that they should really be looking at growing corn in their rotations because they were just growing spring wheat and summer fallow. One of the scientists there jumped up and said, we can't grow corn in North Dakota. I just said, well, Lewis and Clark stopped and bought corn right here, Bismarck, 1804. We should have, the U.S. government should be able to match that.
Yeah.
I did not make a friend. We don't look at what we're doing from an ecosystem standpoint. I'm not sure some of what native culture did was wrong and they moved on too, because we had the ability to do that. But they were limited. If you read Darren Qualman's book, they were limited by lack of transportation, and that was a limiting factor. So they couldn't do the extractive thing because they didn't have the railroad. And there's all these things that we've done that help us do a better job of screwing things up that might just go away.
Yeah. And Dwayne, there are so many more topics that I would love to get into, and you have such a wealth of knowledge to share with people. Where can our listeners go to learn more?
Well, our website, dakotalakes.com, is one place. There's lots of stuff there that really shows a bunch of history and stuff. I suppose I'm going to have to write something, but we have a lot of really good practitioners now in this area that are poking at it. Like I said, that Qualman book is awfully good to get you thinking about things differently. And that virtual field day that we have on there, we have done set rotations here on some areas for 30 years now. So we have a field that's been continuous corn for 30 years and a set of field that have been corn, soybeans, and such, and then more diverse rotations. And we have irrigated and dryland versions of this. And there's very significant differences in the soil. So that's what we did on that. Our part of the virtual field day is went out and took a real high-tech thing called a spade and looked at the soils. And they, I warned the lady, I said, you better have some really good video stuff if you're going to show this, because I can show this in person to people and everybody can see it. But I don't know if you can do it on video. And she did a really good job of getting a crew in there that it shows up really well. So we were really impressed with what got done there. But it's frustrating in that we don't have really measures in science that if I send them those different soils that they could immediately give me numbers that show me how much different it was. I've got a graduate student working on it again, but it's really difficult, but you can see it with your eyes. The first soil health group was based in Akron, Colorado in the early 90s. And they came here as 3 guys, and they came here and we were looking at things and they were trying to come up with this definition of what soil health is. And I took them to one of our fields where it had been native prairie, never been tilled, let's put it that way. It was native prairie at one time, and then it was kind of misused in terms of grazing and stuff, but it never had any tillage done. And we converted it to a no-till system without doing tillage. And I got them to that point, and I took them out on that hillside, and I handed them each piece of paper, and I said, I want you to write me the definition of a beautiful woman, which I couldn't do now because that wouldn't be politically correct. But, they're all guys, so that was a start. But anyway, and they looked at me like, what do you mean? And I said, well, come on, just write it down. What's it take to be a beautiful woman? We should be able to define this. And of course, they can't do that. And I said, there's no way to do that. And they'd write down the hair color and whatever, but we all know one when we see one. And then I took a spade and tipped up a little bit of that soil, and I said, there you go. That's what it looks like. Now figure out how to describe that. It's going to be very, very difficult because you lack that intrinsic thing that you get with all your other senses versus just numbers. And I think that's really one of the keys to farming is, to a large extent, in art. There's science involved, and you got to use science, but some of it's art to know if what you're doing is the right thing. And so some of these really successful guys do a better job at using their senses, I think.
There is still no replacement for the human senses of touch, taste, and smell. There is no scientific instrumentation yet that can replicate what we can sense.
Yeah, that's one of the things I told them. I said, just figure out, because we held it and had them smell it, right? That's one of the things I do. I said, figure out how to document that smell. And you'll be a ways down the road. That's one of the things. One of the issues with precision ag is a great tool, and it's a tool. And we actually still have in our possession, I think, the first yield monitor that became a yield mapper. We had a guy at SCSU that was very creative, and we put a cooler on the outside of the cab of a 4400 John Deere combine and put a computer in there and tied it into the ag leader yield monitor with RS-232 chip in and whatever, and put up a GPS tower and did all this stuff, right? But the trouble with that is digital computers aren't real good at making decisions. And so we're having trouble making that connection between the digital computer and the analog computer that sits between people's ears. And the analog computer is very good at making decisions. The year I was born was the first year my father had a corn picker. Prior to that, he was picking corn by hand. And he had an intimate knowledge of every square inch of his property, because when he picked the corn, he knew where he had the good areas and the bad areas and whatever. And what we need to do with precision ag is try to develop that intimate knowledge in the farmer using this way of doing a better job of measuring what's going on. And I think we'll get there. But precision ag is not a science, and it's a tool. It supports the other sciences, I think. I think it's good at doing that. But in and of itself, I'm not sure it's necessarily a science. And the president of the college will call me tomorrow. Anyway.
Dwayne, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom so freely. And I look forward to actually meeting in person sometime soon and having further conversations with you in the future.
Okay, me too. Enjoy your day.
The team at AEA and I are dedicated to bringing this show to you because we believe that knowledge and information is the foundation of successful regenerative systems. At AEA, we believe that growing better quality food and making more money from your crops is possible. And since 2006, we've worked with leading professional growers to help them do just that. At AEA, we don't guess, we test, we analyze, and we provide recommendations based on scientific data, knowledge, and experience. We've developed products that are uniquely positioned to help growers make more money with regenerative agriculture. If you are a professional grower who believes in testing instead of guessing, someone who believes in a better, more regenerative way to grow, visit advancingecoag.com and contact us to see if AEA is right for you. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you.